Hi everybody. Do you hear that? Just a soft sound, whispering right at the back of your neck. Welcome to Whispering Night. Stories, where stories are not only told, but also live silently in your memory. If you love sudden thrills and unanswered mysteries, listen to the whispers that the night leaves behind. So before that, please like the video and subscribe to channel where from and what time to watch. Now sit back and relax. The main branch of the Detroit Public Library stands as a weathered monument to better times, its limestone facade covered in decades of industrial grime. When I took the night security job, I told myself it was temporary, just a job to pay the bills while I figured out my next move. 3 months after the plant closed, I couldn't be picky. Ms. Henderson in HR apologized for the delay, explaining that the previous security guard had left abruptly without notice. She handed me a heavy set of keys, an old leather folder containing floor plans, and a walkie-talkie that crackled even when turned off. The building's after-hours silence would become my domain from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 6 nights a week. The first few shifts passed without incident. I walked the prescribed route, checked the locks, monitored the security cameras, and then sat down at the main desk with a pot of coffee and whatever paperback I had retrieved from the book return cart. The beauty of the building at night began to take shape, the creaking of old wood, the low hum of the heating system, the occasional clank of cooling metal, the normal sounds for a building that was nearly 90 years old. It wasn't until my fourth shift that I first heard the intercom activate. The ringing cut through the 2 a.m. silence like a knife echoing from somewhere deep within the building. I checked the security panel. All the systems were green. No movement detected. The sound seemed to be coming from the basement, specifically the restricted storage area that Ms. Henderson had only briefly mentioned during orientation. Staff only, she said in a tone that suggested even staff rarely went in there. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the narrow stairs to the basement. The temperature dropped noticeably with each step, and the air was thick with the smell of old paper and something else. Something metallic and sharp that burned my sinuses. The ringing continued, persistent and steady, coming from behind a heavy door marked, "Collection sealed, authorized personnel only." The door looked a bit like ajar, though I was sure it had been closed on previous inspections. Behind it was a hallway lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, the contents wrapped in protective plastic. At the end of the hallway, a red light blinked in the darkness. I approached cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that seemed to absorb the sound rather than reflect it. The flickering light was from an old rotary phone on a small table. The receiver vibrated on its cradle as it rang. The metallic scent grew stronger as I approached, sharp and ozone-like, as if the air itself were charged with electricity. I picked up the receiver, expecting to hear a ringing tone, or perhaps a wrong number. Instead, there was silence for a few seconds before a voice spoke, distant and hollow, as if speaking from the bottom of a well. The manuscript needed editing, the voice said, each word carefully enunciated. The ending never quite came together. "Who is this?" I asked, but the line was dead. I put the receiver back on and stood there for a moment, listening to the stifling silence. The red light continued to blink, slower now, like a dying heartbeat. I checked the phone connection. It was plugged into a wall outlet, but the outlet itself seemed to have been disconnected from any visible wiring. When I returned to the front desk, I found the security log and made a note of the incident. The previous entries showed nothing out of the ordinary, just routine checks, with the occasional mention of HVAC maintenance or electrical inspections. There were no calls from the basement. I tried calling Ms. Henderson's number, but it went straight to voicemail. The next night, the phone rang again at exactly 2 a.m. This time, I came down immediately. My heart rate was high, but my mind was determined to solve the mystery. The basement hallway felt different, colder, more claustrophobic. The shelves seemed to tilt inward, casting shadows that moved independently of my flashlight. The smell of ozone was stronger, mixed with something else now, the faint sweetness of decay. The red light on the phone blinked more urgently, and I noticed something I had missed before. The desk was covered with handwritten pages, the ink still wet despite the absence of any writing implements. The handwriting was smudged and desperate, with countless crossed-out passages and notes in the margins. I answered the phone before the third ring. "The edit isn't complete," said another voice. This one had a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "The characters need to be properly developed. The themes aren't resolved yet." "Which revision? Which draft?" "You know which one," the voice replied with growing annoyance. "The one that's been gathering dust while the inferior works are given priority. The one that deserves its final form." The line went dead again, leaving me staring at the handwritten pages. The text was nearly illegible, but I could make out fragments. The main character's motivations were unclear, the supporting characters lacked depth, and the ending offered no satisfying resolution. I gathered the pages and returned to my main desk, spreading them out under the reading lamp. The handwriting belonged to different people. I could make out at least 3 distinct styles, each with its own unique strokes and pressure variations. The paper itself felt strange under my fingers, warm and textured, reminiscent of parchment. Research consumed the rest of my time. I opened the library's digital catalog and compared the basement archives with the main collection. According to records, the sealed collection contained original manuscripts, letters, and personal papers from many Detroit-area authors who had donated their work to the library over the decades. Many of the names were unfamiliar to me, but a few stood out as writers who had achieved modest recognition before their deaths. I found obituaries for 3 of them. Marcus Whitmore, a novelist who died in 1987 from complications related to diabetes; Elena Vasquez, a poet who died in 1994 from a stroke; and Theodore Blackwood, a short story writer who died in 2001 from a heart attack. All 3 had been working on projects when they died. Their final works were left unfinished. The third night, I arrived prepared. I had a small recording device, a notebook, and a more powerful flashlight. The basement called me before I could finish the first lap. The ringing of the phone echoed through the building like a summons. The hallway had changed again, the bookshelves now facing outward, their contents visible despite the protective plastic. I could see manuscripts bound with faded ribbon, stacks of letters tied with string, and boxes labeled with names and dates. The smell of ozone was stronger, now mixed with the distinct smell of leather and vanilla, the smell of old books. 3 voices came through the phone that night, overlapping and alternating in their urgency. I recognized the pattern now. Marcus Whitmore spoke first, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being heard. Elena Vasquez took over, her words flowing with poetic rhythm even in their desperation. Theodore Blackwood's was the most agitated, cutting through the others with sharp, intermittent demands. They all wanted the same thing: completion. Their final works needed revisions, editing, a proper ending. The stories they left behind were unfinished. Their characters were stuck in literary limbo, their themes unresolved. They spoke of the frustration of seeing subpar work published while their own masterpieces sat in the basement, gathering dust and growing old. I turned on the recorder, but when I listened back later, all I heard was static mixed with the occasional crackle of electrical noise. One night, when I returned to the basement, something strange happened. There were no new handwritten pages on the table, no whispers coming from the manuscripts. Instead, there was absolute silence, an unnatural silence, thick and oppressive. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the space. I touched the back of the chair, and a chill ran down my spine. The chair was still warm. Someone was here. On the table was a blank sheet of paper. No words, no symbols, no markings, just a clean blank sheet. I picked it up, and the moment I touched it, words began to appear, not from pen or ink, but as if the surface of the paper itself was absorbing the ink from within. The first sentence read, "I'm reading myself." I recoiled, dropping the paper. But the words continued to spread across the surface like a smear. The second paper, the third, the stack beside it began to show words too. The words were no longer descriptions, but narratives. They told exactly what I was doing, the way I backed away, trembling, the way I held my breath, the way my hands reached across the table to gather the papers. And then they started walking ahead of me. A few lines describing my actions never done, but as I read them, my body acted as if it were following a script. I turned to the right, just as the page said. I sat down on the creaky wooden chair, just as the text had written a few seconds earlier. I'm not writing the story. The story is happening. Write me. I tried to break it. I backed out of the basement, ran upstairs, opened the fire escape, rushed out into the parking lot, unlocked the car, and drove aimlessly. I checked into a small motel outside Midtown and checked into a room under a false name. No notebook, no pen. I took a cold shower, tried to calm down. And when I opened the nightstand drawer to find the Bible that hotels usually provide, I found a piece of paper there. Do you think you can leave in the middle of a story? I left everything and went back to the library. From that night on, I stopped writing by hand. I just sat there, like a copyist, pen in hand but no control over the words. The stories continued, not just one, but 3, then 5, then dozens. Each manuscript had its own distinct voice, but they were no longer separate. They were one, a complex literary entity, ancient, alive, with its own memory. I began to dream of libraries that weren't real. Places buried underground, filled with shadows and whispers. I dreamed of walking among the dusty shelves, touching the spines of books that, when opened, bore my name, the author of stories I had never lived. The dreams became constant. I woke up to the smell of ozone in my room, pages scattered around my bed, my hands stained with ink, my wrists aching from writing all night. But I couldn't remember what I'd written. I couldn't stop it. The story wasn't just in the library anymore, it had followed me home. I don't know if I became the narrator, or a part of the story. I wrote for hours, my hand moving over the page with no clear direction. The voices guided me, suggesting improvements, offering alternatives, helping me find the perfect words for each sentence. By the time I stopped, the sun was starting to rise, and I had written dozens of pages in neat, careful handwriting that looked nothing like my own. I gathered the pages and climbed up to the main desk, where I found Mrs. Henderson waiting anxiously with a cup of coffee. She explained that the day shift had been trying to reach me for over an hour, that they had found the basement door blocked and were concerned for my safety. She asked me how I was, if the night shift was too stressful, if I needed help. I tried to explain about the voices, about writers who needed help finishing their work, about manuscripts that needed editing. But as I spoke, I realized how harsh the words sounded. The rambling confession of someone who has spent too many lonely nights alone with her own thoughts, who has let isolation distort her perception of reality. Mrs. Henderson listened patiently, occasionally nodding or asking gentle questions. When I was done, she suggested that I take a break, that the night shift could be difficult for people not accustomed to solitude. She offered to arrange a sabbatical for me to help me find stress management resources, to make sure I had the support I needed. I looked down at the pages in my hands, expecting to see the wonderful collaboration I had created with those voices. Instead, I saw only my own handwriting. Page after page of increasingly disjointed words, crossed-out sections, and meaningless notes in the margins. The story I had written was still there, but it was fragmented and incomplete, bouncing between different perspectives and tenses without a coherent structure. That afternoon, I packed up my things and left my keychain on Mrs. Henderson's desk. I never returned to the Detroit Public Library. Never knowing if the phone in the basement would ring again or if those voices had found another companion. I moved to another city, took a day job, and tried to forget the long nights I spent listening to the requests of dead authors. But sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I still hear their voices. They whisper of unfinished stories, of characters trapped in literary limbo, of the thin line between inspiration and madness. They remind me that every story needs an ending, that every voice deserves to be heard, and that the line between reality and fantasy is thinner than we think. The manuscript I had begun that night remained unfinished, gathering dust in a box in the closet. I took it out every now and then and read it page by page, trying to remember whether the voices were real or the products of an overwrought and tired mind. The handwriting changed from page to page, sometimes looking exactly like mine, sometimes like the handwriting I thought I would learn in the basement. I never called the library to ask about the basement phone or the sealed collection. I never looked up Marcus Whitmore, Elena Vasquez, or Theodore Blackwood. Some questions are best left unanswered. Some mysteries are best left unsolved. Those voices could be real, or they could be the product of my own desperate need for connection during those long, lonely nights. But late at night, when the line between wakefulness and sleep grows thinner, I sometimes hear the distant ringing of a phone. And I know that somewhere in the basement of the Detroit Public Library, the red light still blinks and the voices still wait for someone to help them find closure. Story 2. The notification rang at 3:47 a.m., pulling me out of the thin sleep that had become my routine. My phone screen cast a blue glow across my studio apartment, illuminating the scattered camera gear and the stack of unpaid bills that served as my nightstand. That sound followed me home, and from the moment I stepped into my small studio apartment, it didn't leave. Another match on the dating app, though I didn't swipe. I squinted at the screen. No profile picture, just a gray shadow in place of a face. The username readout was missing, 1983. And the distance suggested something impossible. 12 feet ft 12 feet, as if whoever this person was existed in the same space as me, closer than close, occupying the negative space in my bones. I cleared the notification and tried to go back to sleep, but my mind kept returning to that distance. In my 5 years as a freelance photographer in San Francisco, I'd seen a lot of glitches, apps, and GPS systems. The hills and dense urban landscape of the city had ruined the signal. But negative distance, that was new. The next morning brought a fog so thick it drowned out the sound, turning the filet mignon into a gray dreamscape. I took a photo downtown, a portrait for a startup CEO who would probably go bankrupt by Christmas. As I was packing my camera bag, my phone rang again. The signal was lost. It was 1983 again. Oh my God, you are a friend. I took a screenshot of the notification before it disappeared, then opened the app normally. The profile was not there. No chat history, no recorded matches, just the faint memory of that gray silhouette burned into my retina. The CEO's office was on the 42nd floor of a glass tower that seemed to brush against low-lying clouds. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city looked like a circuit board, all lights and geometric patterns. I focused on the technical aspects of the shoot, aperture, composition, the way light fell across the subject's face. But halfway through, my phone buzzed again. Signal lost. 1983, 8 feet. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. The building's elevators stretched endlessly in both directions, punctuated by the soft electronic chime of approaching cars. I opened the dating app, but again, nothing. No profiles, no matches, no explanation for the notification that must have appeared on my lock screen. The ride down the elevator seemed longer than the ride up. The numbers on the screen moved normally, 42, 41, 40. But my stomach churned with each floor, as if I were descending faster than gravity would allow. When the doors opened in the lobby, the sudden light made me dizzy. Outside, the fog had cleared a bit, revealing glimpses of the city's architecture. I headed toward the BART station, my camera bag slung over my shoulder, when my phone rang again. This time I was ready. My finger hovered over the screen, trying to catch the notification before it disappeared. Signal lost. 1983, 2F. But as I watched, the distance began to shift. 3F, 7 feet. It was as if whatever was watching me was moving away, retreating into a space that existed parallel to but separate from the physical world. I turned slowly, scanning the street for anything unusual. Office workers walked along predetermined routes. Tourists looked at their phones. Street vendors hawked their wares. Everything was normal, everything was explainable, except for the feeling that someone was watching me from a vantage point I couldn't place. Not from the windows above, not from the doors or the parked cars, but from somewhere else entirely. That feeling followed me home. My building sits on a corner lot. 6 stories of brick and iron, it must have been elegant at one time. Now it's home to struggling artists, graduate students, and people like me who choose creativity over financial security. My landlord, Ms. Chen, had told me at my lease signing that the building had housed a variety of businesses over the decades. Not unusual for San Francisco, where buildings have many lives. I climbed the narrow stairs to my 4th floor office. Every step echoed in the small space. The acoustics of the building were strange. The sound seemed to reverberate and multiply, creating the impression that my footsteps did not quite match my own rhythm. I was used to it, the way city dwellers adapt to sirens and traffic noise. I opened the door to my apartment. The sensor made a sharp click, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times, but this time it sounded different, like a frequency out of phase. I stepped inside, and immediately felt the air in the room change. Not the temperature, but the pressure. As if someone had just walked out when I entered. I turned, closed the door, and checked the latch. It was all in place. I turned on the light. No light. I tried the switch again. The overhead light still didn't respond, but the coffee maker in the kitchen blinked green. The microwave reset to 1983 on its display. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and shined it around the room. Everything seemed to be intact. Until I saw something. My camera, the DSLR that I always keep locked in a protective case, is lying on the table, power is on, lens removed, and in image playback mode. I don't remember opening it. I walked over and looked at the screen. There were 3 new photos. The first photo is of me, sleeping in bed, clearly taken from the foot of the bed. The second photo is of me, standing by the window, back turned, with light from the street lamp coming in, but I don't remember standing there last night. The third one was a figure. Faceless. Standing right behind me, between the bed and the camera. I turned off the computer, almost throwing it into my pocket. My heart was pounding, but for a moment, I couldn't move. I looked into the small mirror hanging near my desk, and in the mirror, there was a red dot flashed behind me, like the light of a recording device. I turned around. Nothing. But in the mirror, still there. Flash. Off. Flash. I held up my phone, turned on the camera, and scanned the room. The camera app loaded unusually slowly. The screen went black for nearly 10 seconds, then suddenly showed an image that wasn't my room. It was a concrete hallway. No windows. No doors. There was a QR code on the wall, but it was distorted. On the floor, there was a sign, IS, 1983, Bay.4. I closed the app. Opened it again. This time it was my real room, quiet. But the sound was still there in my head, a low-frequency static, long and steady. Like some door in my brain had been opened, or forced open. I opened my laptop. I needed to save those photos, see the metadata. But when I plugged the memory card into the computer, the system didn't recognize it. An error popped up. Unknown format detected. Camera log locked by external protocol, 1983_layer_x. I've never seen an error like that. I tried accessing the data in raw software, but everything was either encrypted, or completely distorted. Within seconds, my computer started to heat up abnormally. The fan screamed, then stopped. The screen goes black. Then a line appeared, in monochrome typewriter font. Profile has been activated. 1983. Know where you are. Keep going. Don't stop. Screen off. All silent. At that moment, I noticed, in the corner of the room, close to the wall, there was asmol cracks that I have never seen before. As if the wall were expanding, or being forced open from another dimension. I left the apartment the next morning like a man uprooted from himself. There was no sound from the basement, no noise, no sense of being watched, just an eerie silence, as if the entire building had held its breath for some reason. But as I stepped out the door, I realized something had changed. The guard was no longer standing in the glass booth in the lobby. Instead there was an empty space, the swivel chair turned slightly as if someone had stood up and walked out a few seconds ago. I walked over and looked inside. The security camera screen was still running, showing the building, the 7th floor hallway, the elevator, the basement, and the view from right where I was standing. But I couldn't see myself on the screen. There was no image of me. It was as if I was looking through a camera's eye, and I no longer existed in the system. I raised my hand to wave at the camera. No response. I looked back at the camera from the outside. It was clearly working, the red light was still flashing, I even heard a slight whirring sound coming from the navigation motor. But I wasn't showing up. A note was stuck inside the guard cabin, handwritten in a scrawl: if you find yourself no longer on camera, go down to the basement immediately. No signature. Just a hand-drawn arrow pointing down. I stood still for a moment. Part of me wanted to run, to leave immediately, never to return. But the other part, the part that was drawn back to reality, to 1983, to the impossible photos, to my name never being on the lease, won out. I pressed the elevator button. The indicator light blinked a few times and then opened. It was empty inside. No fluorescent lights. No background music. Just a dark void, where everything seemed to be sucked out of reality. I stepped in. The doors closed. The elevator began to move slowly, but there were no floor indicators. No sensation of going up or down. No gravity. No shaking. I looked in the elevator mirror and saw nothing. No reflection. I raised my hand. My hand was still there, in front of me, but not in the mirror. The mirror reflected an empty space, just the elevator. Not me. The elevator stopped with a soft click. The doors opened. I had no idea what floor I was on, but the hallway ahead was darker than usual. The fluorescent lights flickered, some glowing a dull red instead of white. I stepped out and found myself in a space I had never seen before in this building, though I thought I had explored most of it. Unplastered concrete walls, exposed electrical conduits running along the ceiling, low hissing noises coming from the vents, and at the end of the hallway, a metal door with no number, only a rusted old nameplate that read, Neurospatial Dynamics, Cognitive Wave Separation Recording Room. I touched the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside was a dark room, lit only by the green glow of dozens of old CRT monitors running lines of incomprehensible code. Brain scanners, microantennas, thermal lenses, all of it seemed to have stopped working recently. A dot matrix printer wheezed away, churning out lines of paper at a slow pace. I approached it and pulled out a piece of the paper. The first image was a brain. But it wasn't a typical medical image. It was a reconstruction of static lines, like a map of the terrain of consciousness. And then, the next image was a familiar room, my apartment, seen from the corner of the wall close to the ceiling. And then, me, sitting at my desk, looking at that same image. Below is the caption: frowny face subject version 239B mapping, status, synchronization 93.4%, separation distance, 0.36 units. A sound came from behind me. I turned around. A figure. Not entirely clear. As if composed of hundreds of distorted scans, the light twitched around the shape. No eyes, no mouth, but something was watching me. The shape came closer, and I couldn't move. Not because I was afraid, but because I no longer felt a sense of ownership of my body. I felt light. As if my body was being read, copied, tiny fragments of memory being pulled out, like wires being pulled from a circuit board. And then, I, or a part of me, started to step out of my body. Not a spirit. Not an illusion. But another version, matching every movement, every glance, every breath, stepped out, facing me, looking at me as if I were a clone. And in that moment, I wasn't sure which of us was real. The version smiled. Not with its mouth, but with a pulse that rippled across the ceiling, vibrating every device. The screens simultaneously displayed the following message. Distance reaches 0.00, sync complete. Welcome back, 1983. The room went dark. And then, the light quietly returned, but this time not from the screen, but from me. Or rather, from the version of me that was still standing there. I, or what was left of me, was now watching the world through those same eyes, but from the inside. From behind that gaze. Uncontrollable. Just a point of view. A frame. A trace. I became the avatar. I stopped again. The sound came back. There was no mistaking it, a slow, deliberate footstep, echoing through my headphones as I pulled the fader. But this time, it wasn't lost in the background noise. It was right in the mid-range, around 650 Hz, a location too precise to be a coincidence. It was as if someone, or something, had inserted the sound into the very signal I was processing. I hit stop. The waveform appeared on the DAW screen, and I zoomed in, step by step, beat by beat. 4 steps. Stop. 2 more steps. Stop. There's nothing in the original recording. I'm sure, Marcus recorded that part during the day, in a different studio, 2 weeks ago. I reopened the project history. It showed no changes other than my actions. But in the waveform, those footsteps were still visible, as if they had always been there, waiting for me to discover them. I switched to spectral view. The 650 Hz range rose, the footsteps were more than just sounds, they had their own shape, an almost biological symmetry. Like a heartbeat, or breathing. I zoomed in further. At the highest amplitude, in the silence, there was something like a voice, a very faint whisper, I hear you. I pulled out my headphones. The room was still dark, the only light coming from the screen reflecting off the brick walls. Sweat began to trickle down my back. I stood up and looked down the narrow hallway to my bedroom. Empty. But the recording device indicator in the studio was still flashing red, recording. I was sure I hadn't turned it on. I walked over and looked at the display, recording. Mic 2 to 3:14 AM, input detected. Mic 2 is the bedroom mic. I haven't turned it on since I moved in. I pulled the cord. The screen went black. But the sound was still ringing in my ears, no longer through the device, but as if coming from inside my skull. A familiar rhythm, like footsteps in a dream, like my own echo in a closed space. I went back to my desk and played the recording again to make sure I wasn't being paranoid. But now, in the waveform, between the layers of guitar and vocals, I saw a new track appear, automatically labeled as Unknown Input 3. I opened it. There was nothing in there but breathing. Slow, even breathing, from someone standing very close to the mic. After 12 seconds, a voice spoke, faint, but unmistakable, my voice. I'm still here. But I don't think we're one anymore. I closed the project. Shut down the computer. Unplugged the entire audio system. But the sound did not go away. As I walked back into the bedroom, my phone lit up. A single notification appeared on the lock screen. 1983 has reconnected with you. There is no reject button. There is only one voice recorder icon running. I touched the screen. The photo appeared, a dark, narrow hallway corner, taken from behind me. I never took a picture of it. I never had any cameras placed there. But in the photo, I'm standing still, headphones still around my neck, looking forward. And behind me, just outside the darkness, was a figure. Faceless. But standing too close for me to feel. I turned my head instinctively. No one was there. Just the faint blue light of the power indicator. But in that moment, I realized, what I am hearing is not outside sound. They come from within the very records I create. The records has started responding. I am no longer the one controlling the input and output. I am just a channel. And what is listening to me, learning my language, is about to reply. I started the mix as usual, this time selecting a new piece, a bare monologue, no background, no instruments, just Marcus's voice echoing through the rough space of the recording. The compressor was set tighter, sharper. I wanted to make out every break, every slight twist between stillness and explosion. And then, as expected, the footsteps returned. Smooth, steady, almost emotionless perfection. No other sound, just that silent companionship, as if someone were listening with me, but not breathing, not living. I looked up at the tape recorder at the end of the hallway, the red indicator light still blinking steadily. Nothing strange. Nothing had changed. I paused the recording, took off my headphones, and walked over to the recorder. The air in the house had changed, not cold, but not warm either. There was just a kind of oppressive silence, as if the whole attic were holding its breath. I turned on the recorder and played it back. On the recording, I heard exactly what I expected. Marcus's voice, clear, the studio sound, pristine. No footsteps. No strange sounds between the compressions. No invisible companions recorded. But I had heard it, I was sure of it, just a few minutes ago, right behind me. I rewind, put on my noise-canceling headphones, and cranked up the volume. This time, at the beginning of the recording, a faint sound came through, not footsteps, but the sound-off whisper. A low frequency, almost imperceptible. Not human, not wind, but like a question repeated over and over again over a great distance, in a language that wasn't quite real. I froze. I rewinded and played it back. This time, the sound no more, there was only silence. I sat on the floor, propped the recorder on my knees, staring into the darkness at the end of the hallway, where the bathroom light faded to a gray shadow. I felt like I was no longer the only person in my body. Like something can enter while I was concentrating on tuning. I felt it moving beneath my skin, not physically, but in a sort of delayed perception. I moved my hand, and it took a beat to register what I was doing. Time was no longer linear. Something weighs adjust back to me. I turned on every light in the house. Every bulb, every switch. I opened the windows, letting the Louisiana night humidity in. I sat in the middle of the studio floor, turned on the computer, and ran the whole process again, this time without compressor. Nothing strange happened. Everything was normal. But when I append compressor plugin, not applicable, only opened the interface, then footsteps sounded, not in the headphones, but directly in space, as if I were living inside a piece of music that I couldn't control. I turned back to the recorder and turned on live recording. As the recording played, I stood still, eyes glued to the compressor plug-in screen. The footsteps stopped echoing and came closer, right next to my ear. I felt a soft breath on the back of my neck. There was no wind. No movement. But there was a presence. Not in the room, in me. I stopped the recording, played it again. This time, it was there. Clear. A whisper followed the last footsteps. Enough compressed. Now it's my turn. I threw the recorder on the floor, stood up, unplugged the device, turned off all the lights. But something was still there. In the darkness, I heard a mix playing. Not through the speakers, not through the headphones. Playing directly in my mind. Marcus's voice changed, drawn out and distorted, as if someone were trying to imitate him without a larynx. I ran out of the house. The night was still deep and damp. There was no one on the street. But when I pulled out my phone to call someone, anyone, I saw a new announcement from the dating app I deleted 3 weeks ago. You in 1983 have completed the synchronization process. A low, steady sound, like deep breathing distorted through thick fabric. It wasn't coming from the hallway, nor from the headphones, it was coming from inside the room. From where I was sitting. I froze, my hand still on the mixer's knob. The metronome kept ticking, tick, tock, and with each beat, I felt something change. Not outside, but inside me. Another compression began, not of sound, but of consciousness. It felt as if my every thought was being squeezed into short strings of data, compressed, and released, into something. I looked up at the surveillance screen. The hallway camera picked up the shadow, still there, but no longer still. It was approaching. Slowly. As if each beat of the metronome were a footstep. I pulled out my headphones and stood up, but there were no actual footsteps. Just the shadow moving. Tick. One step. Talk. One more step. I turned, checked the rear camera. The shadow was there too. Another version, a few feet further back but also approaching, in the same rhythm. I glanced quickly at the left hallway camera. There too. A third shadow. Each camera now recorded a dark entity, was moving slowly towards the central room where I was standing. They are not one. They are multiple versions, coming from different points of the system. Accurately reflecting every acoustic and electromagnetic vibration that I unintentionally created during the mixing process. I reached for the switch and turned off the metronome. Everything stopped. The shadows froze, as if caught between two frames. I felt as if I had disconnected a nerve, a part of my brain had been released from its hold. But only a part. I stepped back, cautiously. As I did, the light from the main display changed. It wasn't the music interface anymore. It was some kind of real-time simulation, showing waveforms. Not sound waves, but consciousness wave. Each oscillation pattern displayed my name in the bottom corner. Subject, 0107 KL. Stability density, 94.2%. A countdown timer appeared in the upper right corner. A cycle played every 15 seconds, just like the gaps in the recording I had checked this morning. I stared at the screen, waiting for the next cycle. 15 seconds. 14 seconds. 13 seconds. I couldn't take my eyes off it. At the 5th second, I heard it, not through the headphones this time, but right next to my ear. A whisper, disconnected from any source. Phase 3 has begun. I dashed out of the room, but everything in the hallway seemed distorted. My perspective stretched, like a skewed panorama. The left and right walls overlapped. I turned around, the office door was gone. Only an identical space version like a hallway running on repeat, with a metronome present in every room. I suddenly realized that I had locked into a space created by the sound itself. A continuous system of resonance, using rhythm to reconstruct the shape of reality. Each beat is a portal in time, a birth. And those shadows? They don't come to haunt me. They born from me. From every version I've ever been, ever thought of, ever discarded. I turned to run, but the hallway stretched on forever, and the metronome started again, even though I hadn't touched it. Tick. Case. Tick. Case. By this time, I wasn't sure if I was actually still in that attic. Or if I had been compress, a piece of data suspended in the time band of the very mix I created, permanently in sync with something, no longer human. I held the headphones in the air, my hand stretched to the limits of physical distance, as if a few more inches could keep me from the edge of what I kept trying to convince myself was a mental projection. But the entity didn't just look, it listened. The shadow tilted its head as if taking in the music with its entire being. And then, for the first time, it moved without me leading. No more wobbling, it takes a step forward. Just one step. A small, soundless step, as if the wooden floor and gravity had conspired. But it was enough to make me step back, headphones still in my hand. My instinct was to run, but part of me, the part that had sat in the dark for hours listening to every EQ detail, every fader push, want to know what will happen if I do nothing. I wait. And the shadow, as if having received the signal of a completed piece of music, raised both hands. At first I thought it was a gesture of surrender, but no, it was guidance. It begins control something I can't see, waving his arms like a conductor without an orchestra, or as if rearranging the sound waves in the space between us. Sound coming out of the speaker, even though I turned everything off. It was the mix I had never saved, a more perfect, more precise, more emotional variation than any draft I had ever attempted. It had nuances I had only imagined but never materialized. The entity's hand was still manipulating the space, and the sound seemed from the room itself, not from the speaker or the wire. It is currently playing musical intention mine, but perfected beyond human capacity. I almost cried. Not because of fear, but because of the realization that I had no longer the best musician in the room. The darkness stopped. It pointed at the earpiece again, then reached to its chest, or what I thought was its chest, and drew a circle. A symbol. A loop. Listen again, I heard it in my head, even though no one said it. I put on my headphones. And the sound changes. No more music. No more footsteps. It saw sound from afar, like an old, distorted recording, of human voices, repeating. March, 1983. 37th note. Response has begun. Subject B shows signs of independent rhythm perception. Do not disconnect. They need to believe they are leading. I got chills. It's a record. Not mine. I took off my headphones. The shadow remained there, not moving any further. But I knew, it no longer lives in the shadows. It has learned, it has synchronized, it has adjusted. And now, it is co-written. I turned the system back on, trying to stop everything. But the computer was no longer responding. The DAW interface showed a single project. Mix_1983_final_master_v1.0. I never named the file like that. I looked at the bathroom door. It's open. The shadow is no longer there. I turn back to the screen. A chat window pops up in the corner. The collaboration session is complete. Thanks for opening your ears. Below the text is a vibrating sound symbol, but vibrating in me heartbeat. And I understand. I'm no longer the only one controlling the sounds in my head. We never told Marcus. There was something sacred about that silence, a strange respect for the entity, as if speaking would destroy something original, or perhaps invite it out again. The album was released a month later, and critics immediately hailed it as an emotional innovation never before seen in electronic music. People said they could feel something in every melody, as if there were a spirit lurking among the frequencies. One blogger wrote that it was the only record that had ever brought her to tears just by listening to the bass line. I don't read the reviews anymore. They make me think back to that night with a strange sense of nostalgia, as if I had fallen in love with something that should never have existed. I started dreaming about it. Not nightmares, but dreams, smooth, rhythmic, where everything vibrates to the perfect BPM. In the dreams, I don't speak, I don't see, I don't remember who I am, I just hear. It's like I've become audio processing software, every note passing through me like a living signal, every beat a heartbeat. And always, at the edge of the dream, I feel it. Not see it, not touch it, but feel the shadow, silently nodding in the darkness, approving or rejecting according to a musical logic I couldn't grasp while awake. I began to wonder if it had really gone, or just changed location. No longer at the end of the hallway, but in the headphones. In the sound itself. In the compression filters, in the EQ push, in the faintest breath caught between two sound phases. Once, when I analyzed the frequency range with spectroscopy software, I noticed something, a faint, almost undetectable repeating pattern at 3.7 kHz. A high mid-frequency, almost a whisper. I zoomed in. I tweaked the filter. It was a voice. A voice repeating a string of characters, indistinct, almost non-linguistic, but rhythmic. Timed. A form of coding? I recorded it, reversed it, stretched it, compressed it. Finally I realized, it wasn't words. It was breathing. A recording of my breathing in the studio that night, but reconstructed into a code. A message meant only for a being to hear on another level. And I thought, if it had learned to listen to music with my device, was it learning toe transmission or not? I stopped recording for a while. Not out of fear, but because I wasn't sure if I was still a mixer, or just a gateway to something else trying to reshape the world with sound. I moved into post-production, where sound didn't need to be emotional, just precise. But even there, amid the traffic, the artificial wind, the Foley footsteps, I felt it. The off-kilter breathing. The silences that were a little too perfect. A drum sample in an empty hallway, but the sound suggested, someone was there. One evening, while working on the sound for a psychological drama, I accidentally played an old demo from that album alongside the dialogue. The instruments, the voices, the ambient sounds, they suddenly matched in a way that sent a chill down my spine. No one could have programmed that coincidence. But it happened. It was as if the shadow was composing everything I touched. I pulled out my headphones. Not because I was afraid of them, but because I was afraid it is true. As I write this, there is a faint tapping sound coming from the hallway, not footsteps. It is the metronome. I haven't touched it in 6 months. But it is running. And its beat is no longer 120, as it was set to. It is 111. Not a perfect beat, but it feels someone is counting with me. And I thought, maybe, if I put my headphones on, and play the right sequence of notes, it will come back. But this time, not to teach me to listen, but to begin record. It wasn't on the rack, nor in the stainless steel trays I usually use to separate the rest of the loin from the back. No, that piece of bone waste in the floor, right in the middle of the cooling aisle, a thin, clean-cut curve, so white it seemed to glow under the dim fluorescent lights. I bent down. It wasn't on any of the delivery orders. I'd signed every check, every batch of meat, nowhere was there any mention of a single piece. Human femur. Its surface was smooth as if it had been thoroughly washed, but the head had small grooves, grooves that I had seen somewhere. Then I remembered. Those grooves are identical to the carvings on the stone channels. Same curve, same proportions. Not by knife, but by something, systematic, methodical. I went back to check the humidity sensor. 95%. Temperature, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. And still falling. The air was thick, as if something were breathing with me, or instead of me. I tried to move away from the cooler, but my body slowed. Every step felt difficult, like walking through water. Cooler hissed a deep, wet beat, just like the sound I made the first day I broke the slate. This time it wasn't just a sound. I felt it. Vibrating floor, in rhythm with each screech. It's like a heart rate. One living organ is waking up. I stepped outside, but when I looked back through the frosted glass, the meat hooks were no longer in place. Some had turned to me, I don't know what else to call it, because the cut flesh appears like empty eye socket, all eyes turned to where I had just stood. I didn't say anything to Marcus or Sarah the next morning. Instead, I ordered a halt to all operations in the cold storage, blaming it on a refrigeration problem, while I came up with a more convincing excuse. I spent the afternoon reviewing the building's structural drawings. There are no notes on the channel system. No subfloor. No basement. There's nothing under the stove. But that is not possible. I see them. Smell them. I hear them humming every night. I decided to return in the middle of the night, armed with a flashlight and a large cleaver. Partly because I needed to know. Partly because I felt like I was being called back. And when I rebroke the floor behind the cooler, the ice channels were no longer empty. They were covered in blood. Not fresh. Not old. Blood warm, still moving, running softly like a steady melody, through each carved vein. I did not hear it with my ears, I hear with bones. A melody call my name, not by language, but by taste memory, smell of iron, salt, mold, and something like appetite. And then, the headphones I left in my pocket turned on, even though no one touches it. No music. Just one deep, low sound, breathing from very close. Then a voice, faint as an echo in the long underground corridor. This is where the meat comes back to mind. I knew at that moment, I was no longer a chef. I am just gatekeeper, watch for the gate to open in the middle life and digestion. And the restaurant I'm opening? It will not serve guests. It will feeding the hunger of something that once slept beneath the ground, waiting for someone to call it by its name in the correct language, the smell of blood, the beat of the knife, and the silence before the butchering. I stopped asking questions, too. Stopped wondering why a tenderloin sometimes looked as if it had been carved by an invisible chef. Stopped noticing that the meat bled in a steady, pulsing rhythm, not real blood, but a dark liquid with just the right consistency to give the impression of life. Everything in the kitchen worked as smoothly as if I were conducting an orchestra, only I wasn't holding the baton. I was just listening. On the 9th week, a special guest stopped by, a well-known food blogger who writes about metaphysical dining experiences. He sneered as he sampled our main course, lamb chops grilled over walnuts, with a sauce made from stewed bone marrow and black juniper berries. Then silence. The kind of silence that sent a chill down my spine, even though I was standing 2 doors down in the kitchen. That night, I saw him standing in front of the restaurant after it had closed, staring at the outer wall as if trying to listen. When I went out to ask, he just turned around and said, "Did you know that this building was built on the remains of an old slaughterhouse, which was closed in 1951 because of a mass disappearance?" I've never heard that before. But I won't deny it. By week 12, I noticed that no one in the restaurant was leaving on time anymore. Miguel, who used to be the first to leave after his shift, often lingered around cleaning his knives in silence. Sarah slept on the couch in the break room. Marcus began burning incense quietly in the kitchen every morning, and I didn't ask why. Once, I caught him standing in front of the cooler, muttering sounds that weren't words, not Spanish, not any language I knew. I don't remember the exact night it happened. I just remember that at one point, while I was doing my nightly inventory, I saw a long dark shadow pass behind the spice rack. When I turned around, there was no one there. But a boning knife was gone. No one has seen it since. At this point, I stopped reading the receipt. Stopped checking the stock. I cooked what needed to be cooked. I didn't question why there was so much bone marrow today when I swore I hadn't ordered more. I didn't question why one night I found a piece of raw meat hanging there, with a faint tattoo still imprinted on the dark skin, as if it had once belonged to someone. I just cut it up, seasoned it, and put it in the pan like any other ingredient. And the restaurant prospered. They kept coming. The distinguished guests, the critics, the bloggers, the foodies. They ate in silence. Then they burst into tears. Some threw up in the toilets, so overwhelmed. One, a guy in a crisp suit and silk tie, fell to his knees in the middle of the dining room, eyes wide, repeating, "I see my mother in that dish." But what worried me most was when a young diner, a boy of about 19, stood up in the middle of the meal and asked me, "Have you ever died?" I don't know how to answer. That night, I heard the sound again. Not from the cooler. From the wall itself. A metallic click, like claws scraping cold steel. I went to the back door, where there were knife racks and tool hangers. There was a new knife. Not from the restaurant. The handle was shiny black, the blade thin and long like a surgical blade. None of the staff knew where it had come from. I took it, and it felt as warm in my hand as the bone that night. It felt uncomfortably familiar. And I realized, I never ordered more knives. I never buy more meat. I never checked the electricity bill or the air conditioning system. Everything was running, always stable, always at the ideal level. But no one knew who was really in control. A week later, Marcus disappeared. No one could find him. But the next morning, his knife was sharpened, clean, and in place. And I still cook. Because the hunger is no longer in my stomach. It's in the walls. In the slate. In the air of this kitchen. And I am, somehow, now just part of the digestive process. Part of a non-human palate. And tonight, I have a new dish on the menu. No one knows its name. No need to write it down. All I know is that table 4 will need a strong bottle of wine. Because they are the last people who will remember the taste of something that should not be tasted.